Welcome to the Hero Next Door podcast, where we feature stories of everyday heroes. These are the kind of people who might live next door to you. They become our heroes by the things that they do that show their caring in the world. I'm Marilyn Fitzpatrick. I'm a psychologist, a professor emerita of counseling psychology at McGill University, and the host of Hero Next Door. Today, our hero is Sheila Laursen. Sheila's been a helper all her life. She started her career as a nurse and then transitioned into community work. She had a long career with the YMCA in both volunteer and paid roles, and has been a contributor to numerous community organizations and initiatives. She'll talk about a community organization that she founded that collects used furniture, household items, clothes, all kinds of things, including money, and gives it to asylum seekers, people who often come to the country with nothing. Joining us after Sheila's interview is Professor Allison Russell. Allison did her doctoral work in social welfare and is currently a faculty member at the Public and Nonprofit Management Program at the University of Texas, Dallas. Allison will give us insights into volunteering in later life. What makes older people volunteer? How are they different from younger volunteers? And how do the benefits that they receive from volunteering change over time? Allison will help us dive into understand how those of us who want to help our clients or our friends realize the benefits of volunteering can understand what motivates them. What keeps people volunteering, and how to make the volunteer experience a really great one. But first, the story of our hero, Sheila Laursen.
I trained as a nurse many, many years ago. So I think I always had an interest in helping other people. That was quite a vocation in the days when I was a nurse. You looked after the whole patient, and it was quite special. And then I had always been involved as a volunteer in the community, and then started to work at the YMCA. I had been a volunteer with the Y, so I knew the programs and believed in the values, and then transformed into the director of international programs for the YMCA. So I got to visit Latin America, several countries, helped to start the YMCA of Haiti. It really reinforced the values of caring, of being practical, of helping to give people a chance to develop their own opportunities, their own initiatives, their own strengths. I'm a member of the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist congregation, and we're always trying to put our values into action. So being conscious about the reality of people really struggling, when we started to hear about the Syrian refugee crisis, and the horrible situation that was going on, the devastating, and then that little boy washed up on the shore. It affected me greatly. So I wrote to several others in the congregation, and I said, I don't know about you, but I feel sick about this, and I really think we need to do something. But we're a very small congregation. We're like 35 people. And we ended up forming a coalition of 4 congregations, 3 United Churches, 1 Unitarian Universalist, called the Summerlee Refugee Support Coalition. And I chaired the working group, the steering committee of that, which led us to applying for sponsoring a family, and then going through the 2.5 years of agony waiting for all the very slow processes to take place. In the midst of that waiting period, there was an article in the Gazette, Haitian woman finds sanctuary in an empty apartment. And a huge article about this woman, and how she and her husband had, their story is very long and would take the whole interview, but it's an amazing, and I cry every time I talk about it. And so I contacted my Summerlee Refugee Support Coalition and said, do you think we could help this woman? Everybody replied saying, yes. Within 5 days, we had a caravan, a van, a car with a trailer and a pickup truck deliver all the furnishings, bedding, dishes, cutlery, food, clothes, everything needed to make this apartment a home. So that started it. And I think that heightened our awareness of the situation of asylum seekers. Since then, we have helped over 35 families. March of 2018, the Syrian family finally arrived. And we supported them, and we're still in touch with them, but they're okay. They don't need us in the same way, so we can help these other families. Anywhere where we heard that somebody was coming in to an apartment and had nothing, they somehow got name and number. I have literally seen an empty apartment transform with our delivery into a home. And you can do that just with things that people don't want anymore. You know that what you've done really has meaning, and you know that it is really appreciated. And it wasn't that much to do, and you make a big difference in someone's life. So that's the kind of thing you get from it. People that we've helped have become friends, really wonderful people who humble me with when they do feel like telling their story. And I find out their story. I mean, people don't leave on a whim. They leave because there's huge reasons. And you just think the little that you can do to help is so small compared to the courage and the crisis that they lived through. It's wonderful to just be doing something that brings a smile to their face. Yes. Something comfortable to sit on, and to know that there are people out there who care about them.
I find the story of Sheila an inspiration. She has such strong, caring values and has clearly dedicated her life to the idea that everybody deserves a chance. Joining me to comment on Sheila's life of service is Professor Allison Russell from the Public and Nonprofit Management Program at the University of Texas, Dallas. Allison studies volunteers, and particularly older volunteers, people like Sheila, who later in life devote regular and often substantial amounts of their time and energy to helping others. I'm looking forward to her insights on older volunteers and to her understanding of Sheila and her comments on Sheila's interview. I wondered if you could just start talking about why you think older adults volunteer. I know you've done some studies of this, and while it may be somewhat the same throughout life, what is there about older adults and volunteering that you think is important to highlight?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, people obviously do volunteer throughout their lives. And actually, one thing that the research has found is that for a lot of older adults, volunteering is something they have done throughout their whole lives. And so for many people, it's a continuation of an activity that they started maybe in their youth. Maybe it's something that their parents did that they taught them was important and valued. And volunteering after a certain age is just a way to kind of continue to live that identity, if you will, and to sort of honor those values that they were taught. We hear that a lot from people. The other thing too that's important to think about is the way in which people's roles change throughout the life course. So one of the ways in which we've looked at volunteering in older adulthood is through the lens of role theory, which is basically looking at the idea that people take on many roles throughout their lives. And as we age, those roles may change. Perhaps our children grow up and, move out of the house, or maybe we experience widowhood, or even just retirement from paid work. So people go through these changes, and volunteering can be a way to kind of substitute for other roles that may have been lost. So you can think about it as, in a way, on the one hand, people may have more time if they're retired, so maybe they can do more volunteering, but also in a way, volunteering can be a way to keep people kind of engaged with different communities, engaged in different ways in their life. And it can help to kind of protect against the loss of these other roles, which can be difficult, right? Just transitions that people go through. And so for older adults, volunteering can be a way to kind of substitute for those other roles and remain engaged in their communities in different ways.
So you're talking about kind of two profiles. I think Sheila would very much fit into the first profile of the lifelong volunteer. I mean, her volunteer career has spanned so many different iterations, but you're also saying for people who want to get involved after they retire, it's a way to continue to be active and to use some skills that they have.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also important to think about too that the motivations that people have to volunteer really do change,
Okay,
even if
yes.
they volunteer their whole lives, right? And I think
Mhm.
the role that volunteering itself plays can also shift as those kind of feelings change. So I think with Sheila's case, right? I mean, she's clearly a lifelong volunteer. She's very embedded in volunteering, but also she has this other kind of professional kind of connection in a way
Mhm.
to giving to others, right? She was a
Yes.
trained nurse, and then she worked for many years in the YMCA, so
Mhm.
in the social sector, right, giving back to community in her professional career. So volunteering is sort of like this natural extension of that identity too,
Mhm.
right? It's that way to kind of remain plugged into those communities of practice, even beyond retirement from those communities. And we interviewed older adults volunteering at a hospital in the US.
Mhm.
We heard similar things from people, especially people who were social workers, were in the medical profession. Volunteering in this way kind of helped them to remain part of those communities. And like you
Uh-huh.
said, to draw on skills that they may have had, but
Right.
also really to kind of continue to live out that aspect of themselves. And I was really struck by what Sheila said and the way she characterized how she was trained as a nurse
Mhm.
to care for the whole person,
Right.
right? So it's really that idea of giving back and not just treating the injury or the illness, right? But really seeing a whole person.
Mhm.
And I think just the way she talks about her volunteering is just a continuation of that too,
Yes. Yeah.
caring for the whole person.
Yes. And indeed, she talks about the connections she made not only with other people in the organization she volunteers with, but she really sees the people that she helps as people, right?
Yes,
They're not
exactly.
just causes, they are people.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's it was so powerful just to see that and to hear that, right? And I think that's something a lot of people experience through their volunteering, but
Mhm.
I think it never stops being impactful when you hear people talk about it in that way and just how they're able to make connections and also kind of even increase their understanding and their empathy of other people's situations that they may have not been able to imagine before.
Yeah, exactly. I know you've done some work. It may not be your central interest, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the benefits that people receive from volunteering, some of which Sheila talked about, but what exactly do they get from volunteering? And I know it's not the same for everyone, of course.
Yeah, for sure. And that's the important thing too to think about is we always think about volunteering as being this altruistic activity, right? That's something
Mhm.
that we do for others.
Right.
Um, but the research shows that people get a lot of benefits from volunteering as well. And I don't think one diminishes the other in any way, right?
Mhm.
Um, you can be very motivated to help other people and still receive those benefits in return. And I think the reciprocity of volunteering is one
Mhm.
of the things that makes it so powerful and so just, elemental to the human experience. Even when we don't volunteer at an organization like a nonprofit, we help other people in our daily
Mhm.
life. And that is, part of what it means to be human. Um, in terms of what the research shows, we see that there's actually connections between volunteering and improvements in well-being and
Mhm.
health. And this is true across the life course,
Mhm.
but we see strongest effects among those in older adulthood. So roughly 60 plus. As we age, the connection or the magnitude of that relationship seems to be strongest. And so while younger people do, in fact, see benefits to their well being and their
Mhm.
health, in different ways. We see it the most saliently among older adults. And so we have many kind of theories about why that is. And, one of them is linked to role theory and this idea that the volunteering can substitute for other roles that may be lost and can kind of buffer against the potentially negative effects of those transitions among older people. But really, the evidence is pretty robust that, volunteering can improve well-being, and it can improve physical and mental health. And it's been looked at and measured across many different dimensions. So looking at happiness, life satisfaction, looking at things like people's mobility, their depressive risk, and, just various aspects of health and wellness that have been looked at.
Okay, so staying mobile, staying active, getting out, it's associated with better mobility. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, some research has shown that, and also it shows that volunteering is also linked to reductions in morbidity as well. And so it can really help to improve people's well-being in certain ways in their health. And also perhaps we can think about it as, especially in as we age, that it may slow the process of physical decline that could otherwise occur.
Okay.
And I think when we think about it in terms of sort of health and well-being overall, the social aspect of it is really key, because we do also have a lot of research, not just on volunteering, but beyond that, that shows how critical social relationships are for health.
Yes.
And volunteering can obviously provide an outlet for social interaction, for meaningful social relationships and cultivation of friendships, and all of those things that are so important for everyone. And especially important, I think, when we look at young people and older people, not to get too, down the road of talking about COVID or anything, but, when we think about COVID and how people were affected just by being isolated, right? That's a clear example of how important that social aspect is to our health and wellness overall.
Absolutely. You mentioned that the benefits were strongest among the older cohorts when they've been studied. I was interested. I think I read this in the study you did in Canada. So I was interested. I'm a Canadian, so I'm interested. Oh, she studied the Canadian population, and it seemed to me the largest group was young people. Is that right? Like there were more young volunteers, even though older people got more benefits.
That's so true. Yeah. And I was the only non-Canadian on that paper, but I was born in Buffalo, New York. So when I went to Toronto to workshop this book with other people, they welcomed me with open arms. They're like, oh, you're from just right across the border. So, but anyways, yeah. So what is interesting, and this is true in the US as well. So the rates of volunteering actually decline as we age. So those who are over 65 are actually volunteering at a lower rate than younger people. In Canada, actually, which is really interesting, the age group, I think 15 to 19, is actually volunteering at the highest rate, but they volunteer the fewest hours.
Yes.
So the average hours volunteered per person is lower.
Right.
The older folks actually volunteer more hours on average per person. And that's also true in the US. So the rates may decline as people age in terms of just the percentage of people in that group that volunteer, but they're going to contribute more hours per person. So it ends up being this really this big magnitude of contribution because they give so many hours, right? And part of that is, of course, time commitment. People are able to give more than they could perhaps when they were working, or when we think about young people who are still in school and maybe have all these other activities that they're doing and, all of that. But it's this really kind of interesting thing that people give more hours as they age.
One of my thoughts about it when I looked at it is, and I don't know how widespread, I know this happens in Quebec. I don't know if it happens across the rest of Canada, and I don't know if it happens in the United States, but very often young people have a volunteer component as a part of a course. So they're required to do some community service. And one of the questions I thought is, oh, maybe that's why the hours are low, but the numbers are high, that we're capturing a lot of young people who are fulfilling a requirement in a sense. And hopefully, if they're like Sheila, starting themselves on a lifetime of community service. But
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And that's definitely part of it. And kind of harkening back to our earlier kind of discussion of motivation and why people volunteer, right?
Mhm.
People's motivations do change. And so for younger people, we see that they're motivated by things like learning, career advancement, wanting to
Mhm.
build their resumes, right? So
Right.
for high school and college kids in Canada and everywhere, volunteering is something that they do because they put it on their resume. It looks good. They can,
Mhm.
maybe satisfy school requirements, like you said, and
Mhm.
help get into college or whatever. But whereas obviously for older adults on the other end of things, they don't express the desire to build a career at that point, and it's
No.
why they're volunteering.
Yeah.
Although some of them do still express a desire to learn kind of more broadly, right, to like increase their understanding of others or just learn something new, but really they're more motivated by the desire to just give back, as well as maybe a desire for kind of social interaction and things like that. But yeah, definitely. I think you're definitely onto something with that. Absolutely.
I was struck when we talk about why people are motivated. I was struck that Sheila, in telling the story of this family that had no furniture for their apartment, and that she said, I cried when I read the story, and that it still moves me to tears thinking about this. Every time I talk about it, it moves me to tears. And and I wondered if that, I know you've interviewed a lot of volunteers. Are there lots of people who volunteer because they are moved emotionally by the plight of the people that they see?
It's so hard to say for every person what draws
Mhm.
them to the experience. Interestingly, one thing we see in the research is that what causes a lot of people to start volunteering in a particular place is simply that they were asked to do so. I mean, it sounds really basic, but if you ask somebody, a lot of times they consider it for the first time or they feel compelled because they were asked directly. But I do think that for sure people see different things around them. They may feel a connection to the cause for whatever reason,
Mhm.
possibly because they were served in some way by that organization in the past, or maybe they just have a personal connection to it, or like you said, they see something and they just feel that kind of emotional response to it. I think it's just very complex and very diverse in terms of what originally draws people in. But I
Yeah.
definitely think that what keeps people going back is
Mhm.
feeling like they're really making a difference for that
Right.
organization and for those individuals, and that they're really valued, right? And one of the things that's simple but challenging for volunteer managers and people who work with volunteers
Yes.
is ensuring that they satisfy that in people, right? That people feel like when they show up, there's something meaningful for them to do, that they're valued by the organization, and that not that they're just like kind of an afterthought or like a chore that somebody has to like find them a task. Whatever may draw us in, what keeps us there is the feeling that what I'm doing really does matter and is really valued. And I see that I have a difference or I'm making a difference
Mhm.
for others.
Mhm. Yeah, you mentioned that sometimes what draws people in initially is that they're asked to be part of something. So our audience for this podcast is really people who are helpers, right? Who are psychologists or teachers or community workers, and we're uh, may often be in the position of recommending volunteering as this would be something that would be good for you in your life. This is something that would help you out. You could really make a difference here. You could have a more meaningful life by doing this. Can you talk a little bit, if you can, about how to engage someone if you had to engage? I know this is not exactly your area of research, but I'm sure you've thought a lot about volunteering. Like, if you're in the nonprofit sector and you want to engage volunteers, you're saying to keep them there, they definitely have to be appreciated, but to bring them in, or if I'm coaching someone, or I'm doing therapy with someone who I think they need meaning in their lives, maybe volunteering would be good. Like, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think so. I think the really cool thing about volunteering is that it's ubiquitous, right? It's
Mhm.
available all over the place. You don't have to go far to find an opportunity that someone is looking to fill for a volunteer role. And the other thing is that's really great about it is that you can find something that really fits your interests and passions and
Okay.
also your availability, right? So I
Huh?
think for me, when I would talk to people about volunteering or maybe even suggest that they get involved, I would remind them that, it can be many different things and
Mhm.
there's many different ways to do it. So I always suggest to people that they start by thinking about what they really are passionate about or what they're really interested in, or maybe something
Okay.
that you want to learn more about, that you just are curious about, right? And
Mhm.
kind of just brainstorm a list of things and kind of then just maybe go online, go onto one of the sort of volunteer opportunity websites like
Volunteer
Volunteer
bureaus. Yeah.
Match, yeah, or any
Yeah.
of those sites, right? And see what kind of opportunities are out there that maybe match up with what you are interested in. And
Uh-huh.
then kind of just reach out to those organizations or maybe read a little more about them first and then decide if
Mhm.
you want to reach out. But the main thing is that you can satisfy something that you want to do and care about and also
Mhm.
make a difference for other people.
Mhm.
It doesn't have to be either or. You shouldn't feel like, oh, well, I guess I better volunteer with this organization because that's what my friends are doing or that's what the people at my church are doing, right? I mean, if it
Mhm.
doesn't resonate with you, there's a million other things that
Right.
you could consider that will be very impactful and fulfilling, as well. And so I think the main thing is just that there's not a one size fits all.
Okay.
And just like suggesting to people that they really think about what it is that I feel I can contribute or what it is I care about, and then looking for something that fits that.
Hmm.
And not being afraid to ask questions, and make sure that something's really a good fit before you kind of commit to it. But yeah, it's a process. But I think it's a really rewarding one. And when you
Mhm.
talk to people who've been volunteering with the same organization for years and years, you can really tell that they have found a good fit, but many of them also will tell you how they volunteered somewhere else before that. And, it wasn't maybe the best fit, or maybe they
Okay.
did it for a little while and they kind of decided to transition to something else. So it's a process, but
Mhm.
along the way, you can really do a lot of good for others and satisfy, different things for yourself as well.
Yeah, I don't know if you have stories about this because I know you did interviews of volunteers, but you talked before about your identity,
Mhm.
and how volunteering in later years can sort of support an identity that you have. Could you give a story or a couple of examples of what you meant by that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So the study that I was referencing that we did, was we specifically interviewed older adult volunteers in a hospital setting. So, and this was a hospital, in the US affiliated with the Veterans Affairs Department. So it's a
Okay.
veteran serving hospital. And so a lot of the people that we interviewed had a connection, personal connection. They were veterans or they had family members who were. And so for those who had been veterans, or were veterans, a lot of them felt like volunteer service was an extension of the service they had done as a person in the military. And
Mhm.
so it
Mhm.
allowed them to kind of remain connected to that community of veterans and service members. And so that allowed them to basically live out that identity in a very tangible way and to feel connected to that community. Um, and I think another example, which I already mentioned, right, but is, those individuals who may have worked in, the helping professions, maybe in social work, maybe in medicine, And so volunteering at a hospital really helped them to remain connected to that community and sort of live out that part of their identity. So, I mean, we interviewed one older woman who she had been a nurse and her whole career. And similar to Sheila, she talked about basically caring for the whole person in that way. And she talked about having retired from nursing, but also like she still viewed herself as a nurse. She's like, I don't work as a nurse, but I am still a nurse. It's something that I'll always be, right?
Yeah.
And so the volunteering at the hospital allowed her to basically continue to be part of that community and to, nurture that identity. And, in spite of basically being retired from the profession formally, for many people in those types of professions, as your listeners can probably resonate with, it's not really a job, it's a calling, right? So it is like really part of who we are. And we feel like we work because we have to, but also the job itself it's part of ourselves in a deeper way. So I think for those individuals, volunteering can be a way to kind of, really extend that. Exactly. And also just on a basic level, if you grow up with volunteering, if your parents volunteer, if you see it around you in your community, a lot of the people we interviewed talked about volunteering as being like innate, right? And their identity as a volunteer was something they had cultivated throughout their life. And even one person described it as part of my DNA, right? So I think it's really interesting. It's not something I really thought about before kind of talking to that person, but it's something that you see kind of implicitly and explicitly over and over again when you talk to people who volunteer, and especially older adults, because they've been doing it for maybe many years, that it just really feels like being a volunteer is part of who I am. It's part of my identity.
And you talked about sort of the loss of a formal role and taking it up in a volunteer capacity, but there's also I know you've done some research on formal and informal volunteering, and by that you mean formal being as a part of an organization that has a structure, and informal being, well, maybe more like what Sheila is doing now, kind of, well, we got together this bunch of people and we collect stuff and we give it to people who need things. I mean, at this point, it's kind of an organization. They have a name, but it's also quite informal compared to, say, the Red Cross or something like that. Is there a difference between either the satisfaction people get from informal and formal volunteering, or any other differences that if I were recommending volunteering to someone, that I might be aware of?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think the important thing is the two things aren't mutually exclusive, right? Many of us engage in both of those things, and we all engage in different helping behaviors with people in our lives, in our communities, outside of the formal structure of an organization. And I think what we found is that really both of those things can be impactful and beneficial for the individual. And sometimes it just takes kind of having a conversation with someone for them to realize just how much volunteering or giving they're doing. They maybe didn't even think about something they were doing in that way before you ask them about it. And then it's like, oh, I guess I do that. And so ultimately, I think you can get sort of satisfaction and you can get fulfillment out of all of these different activities. And it's just when you see a need and you can be the person to help satisfy that, or you can be a person who helps maybe bridge different people together. I think Sheila called herself a connector, which I thought was really, really great. Just being that sort of that link, right? The person who can bring the different pieces together, whether it's through a nonprofit that's formally incorporated, or through sort of more of a loose collective of like-minded people, right? However we end up doing it, I think both of those things can be meaningful for the individual and certainly impactful for others in the society and in the community. And one thing too that more recently I've looked at with some colleagues was looking at mutual aid organizing during COVID. So more so like that grassroots kind of informal helping that people do, where it's not through an organization that's established, but really just kind of neighbors helping neighbors, if you will. And what Sheila talked about in her interview in terms of kind of how they sort of started their collective is really just people who see neighbors in their communities in need, and they can step up and try to connect them with the resources that they need. And obviously it started in part through her church, so there was kind of a link to a formal organization in that way, but it was very much like a small group of people who decided to kind of band together. And I really thought of a lot about the mutual aid organizing that we researched during COVID when I heard Sheila's story, and thinking about just the way in which the community members come together, some people giving furniture, some people collecting it and delivering it, this, kind of grassroots effort on the part of everybody to make it happen.
So, Allison, thank you so much for taking your time and giving us your opinion about volunteering, particularly about volunteering as people retire and get older. Do you have any final thoughts or advice or something you would like to close with?
Honestly, it's been great chatting with you. It was so amazing to see Sheila's interview. I was really inspired by her, and I'm so inspired by so many people I've got to talk to through doing this research. And for me, I think that's what I love the most about it is getting to sit down with people and getting to hear their story. And if you're somebody who's considering volunteering, I think to be inspired by Sheila and what she's doing, and also be inspired by the knowledge that there's an opportunity out there for everybody, no matter what your background or circumstances. And you don't even need to necessarily go to a nonprofit. You can just kind of look around your neighborhood and in your community and find like-minded people who want to make a difference, right? So I think that's what's great about it. And I'm just constantly inspired, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share about what we do, and also to get to hear from Sheila, who's the real expert, of her own experience. So, yeah.
Thank you again, Allison. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Marilyn.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Hero Next Door. I hope that the words of our hero, Sheila Laursen, and the insights of our expert, Dr. Allison Russell, have given you ideas to help people who may want to volunteer find their passion, reinforce their identity, and realize the benefits of volunteering either formally or informally. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to Hero Next Door on Spotify or Google, or watch us on YouTube. And join us again for another episode of Hero Next Door.